our very first episode to cover the letter A. Today, we're going to learn about Charles Frederick Albright, also known as the Eyeball Killer. Charles Albright is a diagnosed psychopath and convicted serial killer from Dallas, Texas. His reign of terror spanned from December 13th, 1990 to March 18th, 1991. Charles Albright was born in Amarillo, Texas in 1933. At the age of 3 weeks, he was adopted from an orphanage by a couple named Dale and Fred Albright. His adoptive mother was a teacher and extremely strict. She was overprotective and hyper-focused on his education, even helping him to skip 2 grades in elementary school. Known as a very eccentric woman, Dell would apparently go from extremes in caring for her child. She kept goats in the backyard so that he could drink the milk because she believed it was better for him than cow's milk, and doted on him in many ways. Dell was very preoccupied with hygiene and cleanliness. She insisted that Charles be clean at all times and would change his clothes 2 to 3 times a day. When he was very small, she was so afraid that he might touch dog feces and get polio that she took him to the Parkland Hospital to see the polio patients locked in their iron lungs and tell him, "You could spend the rest of your days in here," in order to scare him into understanding just how important it was to be clean. However, despite what seemed like a doting mother, she was also quite abusive at times. When he was less than a year old, she put him in a dark room as a punishment for chewing on her tape measure. If he wouldn't take a nap, she would tie him to his bed. If he wouldn't drink his milk, she would spank him. Those who knew them said that Charles always seemed like a happy and well-mannered child. Dell had taught him to speak politely or say nothing at all. She insisted especially that he treat women with respect, and she lectured him about the way that his father had acted greedily when it came to sex. It's also said that she was extremely frugal and would rarely be seen wearing any types of new clothing, and despite her family being quite well off, that she wore clothes from Goodwill and a scarf over her head. So overall, I would imagine that inside the Albright house was a pretty strange and confusing environment full of contradictions. Dell and Charles had a hobby that would become quite the bonding time for mother and son: taxidermy. They would spend hours and days on their most current project. They both found great joy and believed that taxidermy was an art. When Charles was a young teenager, he was given his first gun, which he used to kill animals around his home. Dell would then help him to stuff the animals, as they enjoyed to do this together. It would be the same shared enjoyment, however, that would also become a source of conflict between the two. Charles was enamored by the beauty of eyes. He would spend hours sometimes at the local taxidermy shop, staring at the boxes full of glorious eyes: owl eyes, eagle eyes, deer eyes. It's said that he loved their iridescent gleam. However, with Dell and her frugal nature, she refused to pay the price of such expensive marbles. She would not allow Charles to buy his coveted beautiful items, instead insisting that regular buttons would do the job just as nicely. By the age of 13, Charles had already begun his career as a criminal. He was a petty thief and was even arrested for aggravated assault. At 15, he graduated from high school and was enrolled in North Texas University. His college life would be brief though, and at the age of 16, he was caught with stolen cash from a cash register, 2 handguns, and a rifle. He would spend a year in jail for this crime. When he was released from jail, it was thought that he had decided to turn his life around, and he enrolled at the Kansas State Teachers College, majoring in pre-med studies with the goal of becoming a doctor. However, again, his time in college would be very brief. He was caught stealing several items, and while he was not prosecuted for this, he was expelled from the college before graduating. His failure to complete his program did not seem to faze Charles. He stole documents and forged signatures and gave himself a fictitious bachelor's and master's degree. He then married his college girlfriend, and they had a daughter. He continued to forge checks and eventually was caught in this deception while he was teaching at a high school, and he was placed on probation. In 1965, he and his wife separated and were divorced in 1974. Charles was caught stealing hundreds of dollars worth of merchandise from a hardware store soon after and received a 2-year prison sentence. He served less than 6 months, though, before being released. In 1981, while visiting some friends, he sexually molested their 14-year-old daughter. For this crime, he was prosecuted and pled guilty. However, he only received probation. Later, he claimed that he was actually innocent, but that he had pled guilty to, quote, avoid a hassle. In 1984, he even applied to be a Boy Scouts of America leader. Thankfully, he was rejected. In 1985, in Arkansas, Albright met a woman named Dixie. He invited her to live with him. Soon, she was paying all the bills and supporting him. He delivered newspapers in the early morning, apparently to visit prostitutes without arousing Dixie's suspicion. So those are just some examples of the type of behavior that he did display, and sounds like more than just a slightly shady character. The first known victim of the eyeball killer was Mary Lou Pratt. December 13th, 1990, Mary Lou, a 33-year-old Caucasian woman and well-known prostitute in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas, was found dead. She was found wearing only a t-shirt and a bra. She had been shot in the back of the head with a .44 caliber gun, as well as being badly beaten. The medical examiner had reported that the killer had removed both of her eyes with a surgical precision, and apparently he had taken them with him. The details of this mutilation wasn't shared with the media, so when on February 10th the following year, another victim was found with the same type of mutilation, this is when he was dubbed the Dallas Ripper. February 10th, 1991, Susan Beth Peterson, a 27-year-old Caucasian prostitute, was found on the same street that Mary Pratt was found on, just outside Dallas city limits near DeSoto city limits. She was nearly nude and had been shot 3 times, once in the top of her head, in her left breast, and in the back of her head. And again, the medical examiner had found that the eyes were removed with great surgical precision. It was at this point that they realized they were definitely looking for a serial killer. The third and most gruesome murder in this case would be discovered March 10th, 1991. This victim had stark differences from the others. It seemed as though he had acted in a frenzy and with much less organization. Shirley Williams was an African-American prostitute, and she was found dead lying near an elementary school. A waitress had found her nude body propped up against a curb. Her eyes had been removed, like the previous 2 victims, but not with the same precision. This time, there were lacerations and injuries, and these were not present with the removal of the first 2 victims' eyes. She had facial bruises and a broken nose, and had been shot in the face and through the top of her head. When the medical examiner's field agent pulled back her eyelids, he discovered that not only were the eyes missing, but that he had left behind a piece of an X-Acto blade. Shirley's murder was much more callous in nature, especially if you consider that he left her naked and gruesomely mutilated body just yards away from an elementary school. Small children easily would have been witness to her body. There was also the fact that, unlike the other 2, Shirley was a black woman. Whether or not that had anything to do with the intensity of this crime, nobody can really be sure, but it's definitely something that was part of the investigation. Ballistics comparisons did confirm that the same gun that killed Mary Pratt had also killed Shirley, although a second gun had been used in the second murder. He was much more careless with Shirley's murder, leaving the scene in a disorganized frenzy, and also evidence was left behind. A pubic hair from a Caucasian male had been found on her body. This story has so many twists and turns, and really, I could talk for hours and days about this case, but I am going to try to keep this just to the basics and the timeline in order to not be overwhelming. But I do foresee some sequels to this particular letter of the alphabet. So, how did they catch Charles Albright? What were their leads? The police were perplexed, to say the least, with such a gruesome and strange and unique type of murder, but they really were at the mercy of locals to try and figure out who had been responsible for these murders. Their biggest break would come sort of in a cluster. A woman named Veronica had told the police that a man who picked her up the previous night had tried to kill her, but that she had escaped. 2 days after Pratt's murder, they saw her again with a man in a truck and stopped the vehicle. But Veronica said that the driver was the man who'd rescued her from the attacker. Now, this story in itself, along with another that I will mention briefly, are really quite fascinating, what these women went through and how they escaped. But I, again, I need to just kind of get to the point here. So police took the information that she had about the man she said had tried to kill her that night. They let her and the man go and gave the information to the homicide unit. Another prostitute contacted police and told them that a few nights earlier, a man had tried to kill her. Her name was Brenda, and she described him as an older man with salt and pepper hair and heavy beard stubble. She said that she'd gotten in his car, but that he wanted to take her somewhere else to have sex, and she wasn't comfortable with that. She wanted to stay in the area that she was used to, and so when she resisted his suggestion to go to another location, he became very angry and started yelling and cursing at her. Terrified, she sprayed him with mace, but this didn't stop him. He kept driving. To me, that's terrifying in its own right. So she was petrified, and she ended up jumping out of the moving car and escaping. Thank goodness she was able to escape. Detectives decided to check out the address of the man that Veronica insisted had saved her from being killed. The property was listed under the name of Fred Albright, but Fred was dead. And not only that, days earlier, a woman had called police about Fred's son, Charles Albright. She'd been seeing the media attention and the reports of these murders, and it had occurred to her that something from her past may be helpful to their case. This woman said that she had worked at a store in the mall years ago. Charles came in and gave her gifts and asked her out on a date. Apparently, her co-workers thought that he was pretty creepy and advised against it, but she ignored their advice and actually accepted. In her words, he spun her a yarn, which means basically manipulated her, I guess. He manipulated her and convinced her to move into one of his rental properties. He would visit her often, but eventually he started having really weird sexual demands, and it began to scare her. Specifically, it was his obsession with knives and eyes that terrified her. She moved out, got married, and moved on with her life. However, years later, she says she's still afraid that he would find her and kill her. And she also added another important detail to the case, that apparently Mary Lou Pratt was acquainted with Charles in some way. Based on the reports from the local women who said that Charles had attempted to attack them, and the information from the woman from his past, they now had probable cause and a description that fit Charles Albright. They were able to obtain a warrant and searched the property and home of Charles Albright. During the search, police found a revolver, several X-Acto knives, and a red condom. It was the same color of condom that had been left behind at the site where Shirley Williams' body had been found. Up to this point, his wife at the time was completely unaware of his criminal past, and she claimed that he had been with her every night, all night, but they still did have enough evidence that they were able to ignore her alibi and arrest Charles. The gun that they found did not match the one that was used to kill Pratt and Williams. They didn't find any blood-stained clothes, but they found socks and underwear soaking in bleach. His wife also provided garage receipts proving that their car was not available during the first two murders. Apparently, their car was out of commission, so that meant that he couldn't have gone into town and brutally murdered these women. I really don't know whether or not she believed that he was innocent and was just trying to protect him, or if maybe she knew at some point. It's hard for me to believe that somebody can be that evil and terrifying to everybody else, but that somebody who lives with him is completely unaware. I don't know about that. Hair consistent with the hair on Shirley Williams and other fibers that could link him to the murders was found in a vacuum, but not enough for DNA analysis, because remember, back then DNA was incredibly primitive, and they did not have the resources that they have now. Also, samples of Charles' own hair was found to match the hair found on Shirley Williams' body. However, the sample couldn't be used to uniquely link him to it, so at best this would be, I guess, circumstantial. If this has to happen today, obviously they could link those things, and there would be undeniable proof whether or not that hair belonged to the same person. Still, with this limited yet absolutely damning evidence, in my opinion, Charles Albright was charged with 3 eyeball killer murders, as well as a 1988 cold case, the murder of Rhonda Bowie. Rhonda Bowie had been a prostitute who was stabbed to death. Her eyes, though, were not removed. In 1991, the trial began. However, the prosecution's case began to fall apart rather quickly. Key evidence, like a yellow raincoat worn by Shirley when she was killed, had been thrown away and lost from evidence. And from there, the case would take a downturn, and prosecutors were unable to maintain a case against all 3 murders, or shall I say all 4 murders. The trial would proceed based only on the testimony of the prostitutes that had given information and the circumstantial evidence surrounding the murder of Shirley Williams. December 18th, 1991, a jury would find Charles Albright guilty for the murder of Shirley Williams. Charles has always maintained his innocence, and to this day he insists that he's never touched a pair of human eyeballs. He was, however, sentenced to life and incarcerated in a psychiatric facility. Today, he's 87 years old and will live out whatever time he has left at the John Montford Psychiatric Unit in Lubbock, Texas. Police in Dallas once called him the coldest, most depraved killer of women in the city's history. But Charles Albright touts himself as a perfect gentleman in the presence of women. There are many theories and opinions about this case. A longtime friend who can't believe that he would never have seen the dark side of a convicted killer and doesn't believe that he's guilty. He says that if he was really a psychopath, that it's impossible that he never would have caught a glimpse of that part of his friend. Some believe that the man who Veronica credits for saving her from certain death, if she really did escape from who we assume by this conviction was Charles, some believe that he was actually her assailant, and that due to having been knocked out briefly during the attack, she was confused and she swapped her assailant for her savior. There's so many different points of view and questions about the validity of the trial. What do you think? Was Charles just an odd and eccentric man? Or is he the cold and calculated monster who took the lives of 4 innocent women and the eyes from 3 of them? No eyeballs have ever been recovered. I wonder where they are. What do you think happened to them? Taxidermy project to be discovered sometime down the road by some poor unfortunate soul? Who knows? Well, I think Charles knows. But will he ever tell? That's another story. Thank you for joining me for the first episode of this series. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to bringing you more episodes from the Bloody Alphabet, serial killers A to Z. I hope that you've enjoyed the artwork from the book, the Scariest Serial Killers coloring book, Bloody Alphabet, and I cannot wait to bring you the next episode. Remember, if you like this content, please subscribe, hit the notifications, and don't forget to like and share. Thanks again so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next video.